This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This interview is being conducted for the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project. The interviewer is Risha Rainey. The narrator is Holly Henderson. Holly, how old are you?
I am 45 years old.
Where are you from?
I'm originally from Prince George's County, Maryland.
And full disclosure, so am I. So this is really interesting to have this conversation. Where did you grow up? Did you stay in Prince George's County, Maryland?
No, we left when I was about 5. My father worked for the federal government, so we moved around a little bit. And I considered Jacksonville, Florida, my second home. I was reared there.
How did you end up in Florida?
Well, my father's job was with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and he was the resident agent in charge. So we relocated from the D.C. area to Jacksonville when I was about 12, and I stayed there until after I finished college.
Did your mother also work?
My mother was an educator. She was always in the school system. And then later on, as I was older, she went on to teach English literature, writing on the college level.
Where are your parents from?
So my mother is from Petersburg, Virginia, just 20 minutes outside of Richmond. And my father is actually from Germany. He was born in Germany. He was the product of a serviceman and a very nice Fräulein there in Germany. And my father ended up being legally adopted by his own birth father to come back to the United States. My grandmother thought that after what had happened in World War II, that he would have a better life here in America. And so my father moved back to, well, not moved back, but he moved to Kentucky with my grandfather and my grandfather's wife, Rose, and they reared him in Kentucky and then mostly in the Ashtabula County, Cleveland area of Ohio.
What ethnicity does he assign himself to or claim?
He claims to be an African American, although he looks probably Middle Eastern. He has very straight silver hair, and so when my father travels internationally, they often mistake him for being Middle Eastern, actually. But he claims culturally to be African American.
What was the ethnicity of his parents?
So my grandfather was African American. He was very dark. And my grandmother, Gertrude, was German, blonde hair, blue eyes. And so my grandfather was stationed in Germany right after the war was over. And they started this relationship. And what I later found out, actually a couple of years ago, is that apparently there was a prohibition for the African-American servicemen to marry foreign women. And so that must have been why they didn't get married, because they were together for about 5 years. And then my grandfather eventually was transferred out of Germany, came back to America, married this lady, Rose, that I always knew as my grandmother. And I guess maybe she wasn't able to have children. And so at some point he shared with her that he had this, by then, a 6-year-old son. And so then they made arrangements to go and retrieve my dad from Germany. And that's what they did. And so my father actually lost contact with his mom for about 42 years. Gertrude would write letters to my father, but I guess Grandma Rose was a little jealous. So she tore up all the communication, all the letters that came from Germany. And so my father lost contact with his mom up until about 1993. So I actually met my birth grandmother in 1993. And interestingly, we had gone when I was 14. My dad, my younger sister, and I flew to Germany on spring break to go and look for my grandmother. And so it was at that point when I was 14 that my father said, "Oh, yeah, we're going to go look for your grandmother." And I said, "What do you mean? Grandma Rose is in Cleveland?" He said, No, here's the real story. And so we flew to Germany for 2 weeks. My mom had actually studied German in college, so she knew some conversational German. And so we flew to Munich, and we began this search for my grandmother. And they found the house where my father was actually born and the doctor who lived next door who delivered my father. And so he remembered my dad and he said, "Oh, yes, after you went back or after you went to the States, your whole family moved to the Frankfurt area." And I lost touch with them. And he said, "I don't know if your mom is still living or not." So my father continued this quest to look for his mom. And then by 1993, my father received a letter from someone in the consulate, the U.S. consulate in Germany, and they said, "We've located your mother. She is alive." And so my father started this long distance communication that had to be translated back and forth. But basically, my grandmother was very excited to hear from my dad. And she said, "I want to come and see you in America and meet your family." She said, "But after you left, I ended up getting married and I have another son so you have a brother. He's 7 years younger. And I need to tell him that A, he has a brother, B, he's Black, and C, he's American. And so after I break the news to him, then, let me try to figure out how to come and see you." And so she did. And my Uncle Peter was like, "Yes, let's, fly to America and meet our family." And so I remember pretty clearly I was in college at the time. And so I met my grandmother and my uncle. And he has 2 daughters, Natalie and Michelle. And my older sister's middle name is Michelle, and my younger sister's name is Natalie. So you have 2 brothers with daughters with basically the same names. So that was pretty cool. And then my Uncle Peter's wife's name is Rosie. And so we've got another connection with the name Rose. And so, so I met my grandmother by the age of 20.
What was that like for you?
It was pretty amazing. It kind of felt like one of those Maury Povich shows or Oprah where people are reunited and you're not quite sure how it's going to go. But it was wonderful. And I ended up working for Continental Airlines later, and I became an international flight attendant. So I was able to use some of my working trips, to go to Germany and spend time with my newfound family. And sometimes on my days off, I would just fly to Germany to go spend time with them as well. And my grandmother was one of 10 or 12 children. She was the second eldest. And she has a brother named Rudy. And Uncle Rudy is he and my father are like the spitting image of one another, just a black and white version of one another. Same build, same silver hair, same just facial features and profile. And so it was really quite striking to see this genetic resemblance here all the way across the sea. And so we've just had this relationship. It's been pretty well. My grandmother came over in 2006 when I got married with my cousin Michelle. And she said, "This will probably be my last trip to America because I'm getting older and I don't think I'll be able to make this long journey anymore." And so it was her last trip here to the States. But my cousins and my uncle and aunt would still come and visit, and they still do. And then I went to Germany about, I guess it would be 3 years ago this year. My grandmother turned 90. And so I flew over to celebrate her 90th birthday with my dad and my brother and my stepmother.
How do the 2 sides of the family receive each other?
Great. I mean, they remembered my father, obviously, from years ago. But I think, with war-torn Germany, a lot of the culture is very still sensitive to the war and memories of the war. And so it's always a little, sometimes like walking on eggshells, because you're just not sure how people in the neighborhood will receive you, how they'll receive us as being not just American, but Black Americans, African Americans. But we've always had a very positive experience when we've gone to visit and stay with the extended family and with friends of the family, and even out in the community as we would go sightsee. And I mean, it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool story.
Tell me about your childhood and how you made your way to become a flight
attendant, not stewardess, but flight attendant.
Yes, flight attendant.
It was interesting because, as I said, I was born in Maryland. My father actually worked with the Uniform Division with Secret Service under the Nixon administration. And to kind of move around his career, we lived in Virginia for a while. We went to Georgia for a while, and then we ended up in Jacksonville. And my mother was not quite sure about going to Jacksonville, Florida. It's really culturally more like southern Georgia. She wasn't just too sure about Jacksonville back in the mid 80s. But I thought it was great. We lived 15 minutes from the beach. My high school ended up being 2 blocks from the beach, Fletcher High School, Neptune Beach. And I ended up being the student Congress president. I just had a magical experience in high school. I was in the marching band. I was in the symphonic band, and we always placed statewide for our competitions. And I played the clarinet, and so I had a good time in high school. Even in junior high, I was on the swim team for a little while, so I've always enjoyed swimming and spending time at the beach. And I was involved with our youth group, and our youth group used to travel around. We had a production called Rock These Rafters, and we would take that on the road a couple of summers, and so we had a great time doing that. I ended up going on a missions trip to Jamaica when I was 14, and we ended up building a church in the mountains of Jamaica. And so it was the first time that I had been actually on an airplane and out of the country. So that was my first experience, was going on a missions trip on a plane. And I remember people were smoking, and I just kept thinking, oh, this is going to be the longest trip ever. But I really enjoyed it. And because my family spent so much time in Jacksonville, we were there for like 20 years, we would always take road trips in our family van up to Petersburg to see my Nana, my mom's mom, and then to the DC area to see our friends and family who were still in the area. And so I loved to travel. I loved those road trips, packing up the conversion van, and had a sleep sofa bed in the back and a little refrigerator and a TV. And so it was pretty cool. And I just love spending time with my family, and I love seeing new places. And I think that really instilled a love of travel and culture. And I went to the University of North Florida, which is in Jacksonville, and I studied communications, journalism, actually. And my dream was to be a news anchor, specifically for CNN. I wanted to be a CNN news anchor. And so I interned at a couple TV stations during college, and I did not end up getting hired with any of the TV stations. And so I had a couple odd jobs. And then one of my high school friends, actually, I ran into, was working for Continental Airlines. And she said, hey, actually, we're hiring. Would you like to come work for us? And I said, yeah, that'd be cool. So I went and applied. I was hired, and I had to fly to Newark, New Jersey for training. And when I came back, Jacksonville is considered a small station for Continental. And so you're cross-utilized. So you work the ticket counter, you're trained to work the gates where you load the flight. And then I also worked the ramp. So I would push back the planes. I would take the little tractor to go load the mail to the mail house, unload the mail, unload the bags, unload corpse caskets from, the cargo area, work in the cargo. So it was pretty fun. And then I realized, instead of taking my days off to travel, I could just become a flight attendant and work while I was, travel while I was working. So about a year later, I decided to apply to become a flight attendant, and I was hired and went to Houston, Texas for about 8 weeks and learned everything about all different. At that time, Continental had about 12 different types of aircraft, and you literally have to learn every electrical outlet, every piece of emergency equipment, the seating configuration on each different plane. And it was pretty wild. It was very intense. I thought it was more intense than going to college, actually. And ended up graduating, and my whole class ended up being based in Houston, Texas. But we all thought we were going to be based in Newark, New Jersey. So folks were making plans to find housing in the New York area when we found out we were staying in Texas. So I didn't mind at all. And so I ended up living in Houston for about 4.5 years. And I flew both domestically and internationally, lots and lots of trips from Houston to Mexico City, which it's an international city, but it was considered almost like a domestic service. And so we had to do this But at the same time, it was an international service. So in first class, you had to do a full, like, 3-course meal when you only have 30 minutes to serve, like, this flight full of 200 plus people. And so everybody's leisurely eating. And literally by the time you take off, cook the food, serve it, it's time to retrieve the trays. And so folks are still eating. You're like, sorry, I got to throw that away. And so many, many trips as a newbie to Mexico City. And when you first start, you're on call and they give you a pager. Well, at that time, you had a pager and you would wear your full uniform to the airport and sit in the crew room with your passport and your suitcase fully packed with this bathing suit because you never knew where you would end up. And they would, you would sit there for a 4-hour shift and they might call your name or they might not. And usually if they did call your name, it was probably about 5 minutes before your 4-hour shift was over. And on my very second flight, my classmates, about 5 of us, were assigned a flight to Rio de Janeiro. So I thought, okay, cool. I've never been to Brazil. This will be cool. And on takeoff, the flight ended up blowing the landing gear. And so the pilot, and the sound was so loud, it sounded like an explosion. I thought we were going to die. And so when it was time for the crew to get up, I went to the cockpit. I'm like, okay, what's going on? And so the captain explained that we'd lost our landing gear. And I know that like more than half of this crew are new. And we didn't even have language speakers because in Brazil, they speak Portuguese. I don't think we had any language speakers. It was crazy. And so the whole flight, we were basically using our little crew manual, which is like our Bible, to study emergency landings. I guess, it was a good chance that the flight was not going to land safely. And it was a 9-hour flight. So we had 9 hours to kind of contemplate our possible demise. And so when it came time to land, we're sitting in our jump seats and we had to identify people and the different passengers. I think I was sitting, I don't remember. But anyway, we had to identify passengers called ABAs, able-bodied assistants, that could help us should the plane crash. And so, I'm watching the one lady that I selected, she's watching me and we're both looking out the window and as we're approaching the runway, you can see all of these emergency equipment, fire trucks and police cars and everybody waiting to see what was going to happen with this flight. And so we ended up landing safely. It was a little bumpy for sure. And everybody clapped and they were crying and praying and just thanking the Lord that we had made it safely. And we ended up being kind of stranded in Brazil for about 4 days. So I got to go to Ipanema Beach and just hang out on the beach. And so it ended up having a pretty cool ending, thank God. But that was my very second trip as a flight attendant. But later on, I ended up transferring to Newark, New Jersey, and flew internationally out of there. And actually, and then I transferred back to the Newark domestic side. And then on the day before 9/11, on that Monday, 9/10, I was walking towards the security in Terminal A. And as I was entering security, I just had this really creepy feeling. And these 3 guys, Middle Eastern guys, walked toward me. And I remember doing like a Kodak moment where I just literally turned my head. It seemed like slow motion. And I looked at them, and they looked at me, and every hair on my body stood up. I'm like, oh, that was really weird. So I ended up working this flight to Chicago. And when I came back, I was supposed to take my little flight back to the DC area, because by that point I had moved back to Washington, DC. And my flight was, there was bad weather that rolled in. And I remember thinking, if my plane ends up going back to the gate, I'm going to stay here in the New York area because I had a crash pad. Crash pad is where all the flight attendants stay in between their trips. And this guy that I liked and was kind of dating, he lived in Ohio. He was going to be in the city that night and the next day. And so I thought, oh, I'll just go see this guy. But the flight ended up not going back to the gate, and I ended up flying back to the Washington, D.C. area, and I was off for the next 4 days. So the next morning on 9/11, I was actually, while everything was starting to happen, after the first plane had hit the Trade Center, I didn't know about any of it. I was on the phone with my attorney making my will. And my cell phone, I was on a landline, and my cell phone was ringing across the room. Well, I couldn't get to it because I was on this corded phone with my attorney making my will. So I hang up and look to see who called. The missed call was from my dad. And so I called him back. I said, "Hey, what's going on?" He said, "Where are you? Where are you?" I said, I'm in Washington, D.C. at home. What's going on?" He said, "Turn on the news." And then everything unfolded with 9/11. So it really rocked me psychologically because it could have been any one of my family members who were able to fly for free on my benefits on one of the planes. My family didn't know where I was until they got a hold of me. And then that whole day, the phone system went a little wonky because everybody was trying to reach everybody on the phones. And so a lot of people couldn't get a hold of me. And then later on, I found out that one of the flight attendants that worked for United lived in my crash pad building, a Black lady, and she was on Flight 93 that went down in Pennsylvania. And then much later, we found out that those 19 terrorists had actually done dry runs on many of the flights on Continental. And they had actually done a dry run the day before on 9/10 at the Dulles International Airport. So when I found that out, I called the FBI and I said, "Hey, look, this was my experience the day before. Maybe the guys were at Terminal A doing a dry run as well." I think it was them. I think it was 3 of the 19 terrorists that I saw the day before. And so after that experience, it really shook me to my core. And I realized that flying would never be the same as a crew member. And I realized that I was done. I just was not ready and would not be ready to go back as a crew member. And so I ended up taking an extended leave of absence with Continental. And in the interim, I ended up being selected by the Ehrlich Steele administration to be a gubernatorial appointee. And I worked as the deputy director of communications for BWI Airport doing media. So it was a good fit because I enjoyed the airlines and I had a degree in communication. So I really had a good time working for BWI Airport. And then eventually I just resigned from Continental and didn't go back.
You were appointed as the Deputy Director of Communications for BWI Marshall Airport. What were some of your responsibilities and how long did you stay in that position?
I came at a really exciting time to the airport because at that point, it wasn't even called BWI Marshall Airport. It was still BWI International. And one of the projects there was the renaming of the airport to honor Thurgood Marshall. And it was also the time where they were adding the new terminal for Southwest. And so all the construction was going on for that. And so I helped to plan and organize the grand opening event of Terminal A for Southwest Airlines. We opened the new rental car facility. There was a new cargo area that opened. And so there was a lot. It was like a multi-billion-dollar expansion of BWI Airport. So my responsibilities included writing press releases, answering media inquiries, not just for all of the activities going on with all of the construction, but also if there was an emergency. So if there was a plane coming in with an emergency landing, had to answer the media inquiries about that. So we were always on call for the media, and had a staff of probably about 6 or 7 people there. And so we all would take shifts being on call for those midnight calls that usually came in. Because what happens is reporters have police scanners. And so anything that comes across the police scanner in an emergency fashion, and lay people can access this equipment as well. And so one of my jobs before I moved to Maryland was working as an assignment editor on the weekends for an ABC affiliate in Jacksonville. And so I had the police scanner. So I would listen in the middle of the night and like, oh my gosh, what's going on? There's a police chase on 5th Street. And so, we would send a crew out there if necessary to cover. So when we work for the airport, because, airports are open all night, anything can go on. It was a really cool time. And then I ended up being selected to be the director of communications for the Maryland Transit Administration downtown Baltimore. And The MTA at that point was the 10th largest transit system in the nation, with 93 million annual trips over 6 modes of transportation, 3,300 employees, and I was over a staff of 14 people at this point. And so my responsibilities grew with my title. And that was really challenging. At that point, the Greater Baltimore Bus Initiative was going on, called GIBI. It was very, very controversial because the bus system had not been overhauled ever in the 30 some odd years that it had existed. So the population had grown, new bus routes were needed, bus routes were changed. And so they had all of these public meetings that we had to go and attend, and hearings. And so there were many, pretty much nearly every day. And I reported not only to my administrator for the Maryland Transit Administration, but also to the press office for the Secretary of Transportation, MDOT, and also to the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor's press offices as well. So I had a lot of people that I had to report to and make sure the information was always accurate and that the messaging was always accurate. And so, you've got internal politics and you've got external politics going on at the same time. And the Ehrlich administration did not get a second term. And so at that point, I was one of 17 political appointees at MTA. And by that point, I had gotten married and was actually expecting. And I just remember thinking, okay, they're probably going to let me go. And I got the call one afternoon. Well, actually, that morning, I happened to be in the HR office, and I remember seeing the chief legal counsel in there, and she was very upset. And I thought, oh, here we go. Like, people are getting their pink slips. And so that afternoon, I got a call from MDOT and basically saying, we've let go a lot of people today, but you're one of the few people that we would like to keep. You're doing an excellent job. We really like you. Would you like to stay on? And so I ended up staying on for the O'Malley administration. And I stayed on for a few months, and this was my first time, getting ready to be a mom. And so eventually I just ended up deciding that I wanted to be a homemaker. And so I ended up leaving the administration, and I've been home ever since.
While you were working at the transportation agency, did you receive any training or education for your job?
Actually, before I transferred from BWI to the MTA, I started a graduate program at Morgan State. It was a Master of Science in Transportation Management, and it was actually part of Morgan's engineering school, which I just thought was completely wild because my undergrad was in communications, and I'm here in these classes with civil engineers and mechanical engineers that they had as their day job. And the program was so intense, Risha. A lot of the people ended up dropping out of the program. And I struggled in high school with like trig and trigonometry and some of those higher level maths. But then when I got to grad school, I was able to do calculus very easily. To this day, it baffles my mind. And I ended up finishing the program. Like I said, a lot of people that were engineers by career in their day job dropped out of the program. I ended up getting through the program in 3 years, and I ended up writing my thesis on the impact of 9/11 on airport security systems, a case study of BWI Airport. And my thesis defense was 3 hours long. I thought I was going to die, and I just had to make a few revisions, and I literally had typed up my thesis in maybe 2 months. I was able to put it all on paper and get it together and then defend it. And so I have an M.S. period after my name now. And that degree, technically, I should be able to run my own airport or port or railway system. But, I could probably be the next Secretary of Transportation, I thought at the time, if I wanted to continue on that path. At the time, that was the thought.
But you decided to become a full-time homemaker and mother.
You know, I wasn't really there's a book actually, What to Expect When You're Expecting, and it's a popular book for pregnant moms, and I read that. But what I wasn't expecting was this chemical bond that started in utero. I'd heard about, after the child is born and the bond that mothers share, especially if you're nursing, but the bond starts in the womb. And I just remember there was a shift one day. And I told my husband, I said, look, I'm not going back to work. I didn't even ask. I just said, I'm not going back. And so Michael, this awesome and sweet as he is, kind of just looked with wide eyes like a deer that had just gotten, in headlights. And so he was like, I don't know how we're going to do this financially. And I just said, you know what? The Lord's going to provide. And he did. And we just decided at that point to whatever financial decisions needed to be made, if we bought another house or whatever, that they would just be done on Michael's income. And so we just made very prudent decisions, and that has allowed me to stay home. I now have 3 children. And so at this point, they are my job. It's unpaid work. It's a lot of work. And actually, I ended up having 3 C-sections. So it took about 2 years per surgery to really physically recover. So I was kind of out of the loop for a while. I couldn't imagine having gone back. And then when my eldest son, Paul, was about 3, he was exhibiting a lot of kind of quirky traits. And so we weren't quite sure what was going on. So we took him up to Johns Hopkins, Kennedy Krieger. They have an autism clinic. And they ended up evaluating him, and they said, well, we don't think he's on the autism spectrum, but we see why you're concerned. They said you should test him when he's a little older. And I said, okay. And so we ended up moving from where we were back to Prince George's County, from Hartford County to Prince George's County to be closer to my in-laws. And we ended up going overseas for about 90 days for Michael's job. And we ended up getting pregnant while we were in Germany. So I brought back a little piece of German chocolate with us on that flight. And my son Preston was born on 11/11/11. And he almost, so because I gave birth in Virginia and then we lived in Maryland, we did not get the newborn screening results back until day 8. And so I got a call from his pediatrician, and they said, can you come see us first thing in the morning? And I said, sure. So Michael and I grabbed Paul and Preston, and we went in, and it was very quiet in the doctor's office, and the staff had that look, that nervous look. And so the pediatrician pulled open her very old medical textbook, and she had a very serious look on her face. And she said, well, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but his newborn screening came back for this L-carnitine deficiency. And we don't know much about it because the children don't live past a few days old. So there aren't any case studies for toddlers. So in essence, she was telling my child only had a few days to live, but this was day 8. And so she said, you've got to just make sure his glucose levels are fine and nurse him every few hours. And then she kind of just closed her book and said, do you have any questions? And I don't think the shock had really hit yet. But as we were walking out of the doctor's office, I think the reality of what she said is that my child could die at any moment really hit home. And so we immediately started calling our parents. And my father said, no way are you waiting till something happens to go to the emergency room. He said, you need to go right now to Children's National Medical Center in DC and see what's going on. And sure enough, we get there, went to the emergency room. They ended up admitting us. We were there for a week. And so they found out that Preston had high blood pressure as a baby. And he ended up being on high blood pressure medication for a year. He was eventually cleared by the nephrologist, cleared by the cardiologist. But the fact that my child could go at any moment was definitely a life-changing experience. And so it was just another confirmation that I needed to be home. And then 2 years later, little Phoebe came along. And so by then, because I had already had 2 C-sections, they scheduled me for a 3rd C-section. And I went in the morning, and the surgery was supposed to be at 10, and it got pushed back because another lady had an emergency C-section. So they didn't get to me until about 1 o'clock that afternoon. And then when we got back into the surgery room, it got very quiet. And I didn't know what I was having because it was supposed to be a surprise. The gender reveal was going to be a surprise at delivery. And so Michael at one point kind of looked over the curtain and he said, "Is everything okay? Like, what did she have?" And they said she had a girl. And then they got quiet. And then they said, "Okay, she's okay." She had the cord double knotted around her neck. They said it looked like a double strand of pearls. But I almost lost her. And so it was just another confirmation, like, I'm going to spend every possible moment with these children. And thankfully I did, because as it turned out, we the kids end up having a lot of health issues, all three of them. And 2 years ago, when we relocated to Charleston, South Carolina, I had all three of them professionally evaluated and found out that all three of them are on the autism spectrum. With Preston, my middle son, being, there are 3 levels to autism, and each level is they need more levels of support. And so Preston is level 2 on the spectrum. And so not only do they have autism, but they also have what they call comorbidities, which means that you have other health or learning, in this case, learning disorders. So they're all on the spectrum, and they have either ADHD or dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia. And so it again confirmed my, that I needed to be home. So I've been homeschooling now. This is my 10th year. And because I was homeschooling Paul, I was able to really follow how he was learning and the challenges that he was learning, especially by the time he hit 3rd or 4th grade. And I bring all of this up because a lot of people, it's difficult to talk about your child, especially if they're struggling. It's difficult to talk about and know someone with one child with special needs. But when you have 3 children with special needs, it's a whole nother ballgame. So I've spent the last couple of years really being an advocate now for children with special needs in terms of education. My research found that children with special needs are more likely, probably 50% or more likely, to drop out of high school. And those same children that end up dropping out of high school end up choosing badly, choosing poorly. And so at some point they end up in jail. They end up in prison. And so they have identified this as the school to prison pipeline. But what my research really showed me is that these same kids who have ended up in jail, the majority of them are special needs. They have found, in pretty much every state, that these children who had difficulties in school, whether it was dyslexia or autism or whatever, they didn't get the support services that they needed. And so they ended up making poor choices. And now they're in jail. Our jails are full of people of color, predominantly with special needs. And I think that our elected officials, our boards of education, communities really need to know about this and find a plan that will work. And these kids, I've coined the term, well, I don't know if I coined the term, but I use the term uniquely special. They're different from the other kids, but they're still special. And they need more support than ever.
I doubt that you have spare time, considering all that you've just shared.
What's that?
If you do have spare time, what would you like to do with it?
Yes, my days are very full. Being a homeschooling mom to 3 uniquely special children, that's for sure, and being a wife. In my so-called spare time, usually in the middle of the night when the house is quiet and I have some time to myself, I enjoy reading. I enjoy researching by nature. I love to read medical, scientific textbooks. I love reading the footnotes of books to find additional information so I can do additional reading. I'm one of those probably geeky kids, but it's okay. So I read a lot. I research a lot. I enjoy working on my family tree. Genetic genealogy is a hobby of mine, and trying to find those elusive ancestors. I enjoy swimming, time at the beach, traveling, to name a few.
How did you know that you descended from a patriot of the Revolutionary War?
So speaking of genetic genealogy, the path really started with my mother always sharing information about her side of the family. And the most special person that I learned on her side of the family was actually Peter G. Morgan. Peter G. Morgan was born into slavery, and he ended up being apprenticed as a shoemaker. And he earned enough money later as he was married to buy his wife's freedom and that of his children. And after the Civil War, Peter G. Morgan was selected to serve on the Constitutional Convention to write a new state constitution to bring Virginia back into the Union. And then after Virginia was voted to bring back into the Union, Peter G. Morgan was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates as one of the first Blacks elected from the city of Petersburg. And so I always heard about Peter G. Morgan. Peter G. Morgan was also a political appointee. He was actually a presidential appointee to be the U.S. postmaster in Richmond after the Civil War. So being a political appointee also runs, it's in my DNA. And interestingly, so Peter G. Morgan is my third great-grandfather, and former NAAC president Benjamin Jealous shares the same third great-grandfather, and he was actually featured talking about Peter G. Morgan on Finding Your Roots a couple years ago. So that was pretty special for me. But knowing all this about Peter G. Morgan kind of started this love of, well, who are my family? Where are my roots? Let me find my roots. And so I remember that's kind of when Ancestry really took off about 17 years ago. And so I took advantage of the 2-week free trial on Ancestry.com, and I literally spent day and night building my tree out as far as possible, talking to my mom, getting information, stories, and just collecting it on Ancestry.com. So this went on for about 7 years. And then by year 7, I had come across some other ladies that were involved with the DAR. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. So I said, I wonder if I have any patriots. And so simultaneously, my father's side, the Riley Ellison side, our patriarch was Preston Riley, who my son Preston is named for, my second great-grandfather. And the family mystery was who was the father of Preston Riley. All they knew was that he was the white judge in this town of Butler, Taylor County, Georgia. So I just decided one day to Google everything I could about Butler, Taylor County, Georgia. And I came across some of the founders, and I saw a T.J. Riley. I'm like, well, I wonder if that's my guy. So as I investigated more, I found out that T.J. stood for Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson Riley. And Thomas Jefferson Riley's brother was Alexander Hamilton Riley. And as I popped those names into my tree on Ancestry.com, I ended up finding more and more documents that ended up getting back to Jacob Riley, who was my 6th great-grandfather who served in the Revolution. But no one had ever tried to document him, apparently, as their patriot. And that's kind of where the journey started.
When you found him, how did you know that he contributed to the American Revolution, and what was his service?
So I was fortunate enough to have befriended a lady that popped up as one of my genetic DNA cousins who was in the DAR. And she said, well, let me help you see what I can find. And so at one point I had about 7 volunteers, some paid, some non-paid. And we all kind of worked collaboratively on this team, and some people found different documents, and I found different documents, and we were able to find some books in the library in Macon, Georgia. And, it had a copy of T.J. Riley's family Bible that had Preston Riley's mom listed as one of the slaves of the Riley family. And so the documentation just started to unveil itself, and we were able to put it all together. So actually, I had nearly everything that I needed to apply. And the regent of the chapter in Maryland put forth her expertise, and she wrote this fabulous analysis that tied up all the loose ends that I needed for one of the generations, and ended up finding a record from the Freedmen's Bureau of T.J. Riley and Sally, Preston's mom, with 2 other children by T.J. Riley. And so that was kind of like the icing on the cake, because Preston came a couple of years after the Civil War was over. And actually, T.J. Riley was the wealthiest man in Taylor County at that time. And he was a judge. He was a political. He served in the Georgia House of Delegates. I've got all these political people in my family tree, so it's in my DNA for sure. And his brother served on the opposing political side, and so there was some family political rivalry there. And as wealthy as T.J. Riley was, and all of his documents that we found, we were not able to find an obituary for him, which I think is still very, very odd. I'm thinking that his brother, who ended up being a judge after TJ died, kind of got rid of some of those documents. Because, how do you go from being like the wealthiest man to kind of going into obscurity? It's still very much a mystery, one that I hope that I one day will be able to solve, I hope. But also on that family line, on the other side, on the Gray side, I found out that I'm a distant cousin of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X's, I believe it was his grandfather ended up being lynched in Georgia. And that's why Malcolm X's dad moved the family out to the Midwest. So again, another very influential political relative in my tree.
Once you found out that your ancestor contributed to the American Revolution, how did that make you feel, especially as a woman of color in the United States?
Right. So clearly, Jacob Riley was not a person of color. Jacob Riley was originally from Orange County, North Carolina, and he made his way down to Georgia. And what's interesting is that his descendants, getting down to T.J. Riley, so Sally, who was the mother of, so Preston's parents, T.J. Riley and Sally, ended up being, I think, third cousins to each other. So you have this black woman, slave, and this white man who were actually kind of like a Thomas Jefferson, in the whole Sally Hemings story of her being the half sister. I mean, the relations there. So it ended up that the black and white Rileys and the Grays go back to Plymouth Rock, ended up intermarrying one another, or at least having children with one another. And so, I'm a product of this union, good or bad or indifferent, sad or indifferent. And my goal, I've heard that people say, be careful when you do genealogy research because you never know what you're going to find out. And I think everybody's looking for a happy ending and a cool story to tell. But you've got to be willing emotionally, psychologically, to take the good and the bad stories that come with what you find out. And I was always open to whatever information came about. And so I'm a product of this part of history. And I'm proud to be a product of this part of history. And I'm proud that I can share the research that I found with my other family members. But I want to go back to a quick point. when I first started and I was sharing the information about Peter G. Morgan, I thought that my application into the DAR was going to be on my maternal line. So it was really quite a turn of events that I ended up getting on my paternal line into the DAR. And I actually believe that I have probably 4 or 5, at least, people of color that fought in the Revolutionary War on my maternal line based on genetic genealogy, based on these various DNA tests that I have done. But I'm just missing a couple of generations too many to be able to apply. And so that's the next chapter in my life. If I can find those missing documents, if I can do that for my mom, that would be quite grand.
Preston Riley was the son of the white judge and slave. What do you know about their relationship? Was it a loving relationship?
I believe that it was. The picture that I have of Preston Riley, he's very, very fair-skinned. And I think what happened was at some point, the white Riley family probably were very uncomfortable with whatever the relationship was. That Freedmen's Bureau document that I mentioned earlier, Thomas Jefferson Riley was petitioning to the court to be able to care for these brothers, older brothers of Preston. He wanted to be able to provide for them, but legally, he had to make it known to the court. And he did leave land to his sons and to Sally. I think that T.J. Riley made a choice to go off and live with Sally, and that's why we don't necessarily know where he's buried, or we don't know much more after maybe he kind of cut ties with his family is what I'm thinking happened, and went to live with this newfound family, and then maybe he was just kind of cut off from the Rileys in that way. But I do think that there was a loving relationship. Like I said, he left them land. He made sure they were provided for, and that land is still in the Riley family to this day.
Tell me about your patriots. You have more than one?
Well, so Jacob Riley's son, John, was a teenager and served in the North Carolina militia in Orange County. And so after I was able to be accepted and inducted into the DAR, I worked on the son for my supplemental, my first supplemental, my only supplemental. And so now I have documented both my 5th and 6th great-grandfathers as having Jacob Riley rendering material aid. He gave money. He had money. He gave money to the cause for independence, and his son served in the militia.
What was your emotion that you felt when you learned about these men that contributed to the founding of this country? Were you moved in any way, feeling that possibly this changes your place in America or how you feel as a citizen of this nation?
When I was in the 4th grade, I remember members, ladies, daughters of the DAR coming to speak to my 4th grade class. And I remember thinking as a 4th grader, how cool is that they know that they are descendants of folks that we learn about in the history books. And I was always so fascinated and proud for them that they were related to these men and women who fought in the Revolutionary War. And then in 10th grade, we had another DAR lady come and speak in my high school. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, I remember in 4th grade they came and spoke. But never in a million years did I think that I would become one of the daughters, become among the ranks of people who can trace their lineage back to the founding fathers and mothers of this country. So absolutely, I feel a sense of pride, a deeper sense of patriotism and loyalty to this country. My flesh and blood fought, gave, participated in the cause for freedom. I mean, the irony is that, we all are created equal, but they weren't necessarily. The people of color weren't back, during the 1700s. But my ancestors, black and white, still gave their lives, their fortunes, their reputations to be able to fight for a cause that would impact generations, that would impact the world. And I get a little teary-eyed thinking that I do have found my place in history in a way through them. And that was why it was important for me to be able to join the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, to be able to officially document this journey, to officially document my lineage and have it accepted by this international lineage society. It made it official. It made it valid.
How did you feel about joining an organization such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, who had some history of past discrimination against Black members?
Right. It's such a touchy type of conversation because I was on a Facebook forum the other day of African American genealogy, and folks were talking about them exploring the possibility, or maybe they even have the documentation of joining the DAR. And to this day, it's still very much black and white, no pun intended, of I would never join them because of the history. In the spirit of Marian Anderson, I would never join them, even though Marian Anderson ended up, singing. I feel like if Marian Anderson could kind of move towards some type of forgiveness, then maybe we can too. So it never bothered me in that way that, well, I'm going to hold this against the DAR. I always found it as, well, I belong as well. My people fought too. And if I have the requirements that they are seeking, that they want to be able to apply, and I can prove that, then absolutely I'm going to at least make an attempt to submit my application and see what happens. I mean, there's always the possibility that it's rejected or you don't have the information that they want in a specific manner. And so I was delighted when it came back approved. And he was a new patriot. The DAR did not know about Jacob Riley. I'm a woman of color. I thought that was important, that I could represent my family, represent my community, represent other women of color, and show a sense of solidarity that these are our ancestors too, whether our patriot is white or black or Native American or Jewish or whatever, they belong to us. And to make it official, again, like I said, for me, that was important to have it kind of validated by this international organization, that my research was accurate and that I've contributed now to history. And I definitely feel a sense of pride and a sense of, I'm really grateful. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm the first person in my family. I'm kind of wiping away the tears. I'm the first person in my family to seek out this type of information and to move forward in this manner of joining any lineage organization. It seems that there's always one person in every family, from my observation, that holds the torch of looking for those ancestors, of wanting to know. And I think that that's there's a purpose in that.
Talking about emotion, Holly, had the privilege of and unique experience of being there during your new member welcome ceremony.
Yes.
And I was there to see how emotional you were. You were there with your husband and your 3 children standing in front of the room, and you became very emotional. Tell me about that emotion. What were you feeling and thinking at that moment?
The same emotions that I'm thinking and feeling now. Like, wow, this is I've done something really remarkable. I mean, for 120 years, my family did not know the first name of this patriarch of our family. And just solving that one mystery opened the door to finding someone who fought in the Revolutionary War, someone whose father gave money, had money to give in the aid of bringing independence to this country. And I think that, and I really believe that everyone wants to feel valued. Everyone wants to have a sense of identity and purpose. And when you find that connection to history, to know that, wow, maybe my sixth great grandfather knew George Washington. Maybe he saw him. Maybe he saw one of these other founding fathers that we read about in the history books. But in his own way, he was a founding father in a different way, right? He wasn't a George Washington, but he fought alongside other people who made this country what it is. That blood is running through me. And so it does bring in this deep sense of awe. I'm in awe every time I think about it. And I'm in awe that I actually have more patriots hidden away in my tree. And if I could only just find them, if I could only just validate them for my mother's side, for my mom, for other members of my family, that would be the best like Christmas present ever. That would just be amazing. But I've also had to reconcile that I may not ever be able to find the answers to some of these questions that I seek, to find the documentation that I need for these other patriots of color. But that doesn't take away who I am. Even if I never get that officially verified or approved or accepted by a lineage association organization, that doesn't take away who I am. That doesn't take away my identity, my sense of belonging, that my people helped build this country too. Yeah, I get very emotional about it in a good way, in a happy way.
Have other family members joined any other lineage societies because of your research?
I have a couple family members that say they're interested in joining the DAR, but haven't made that final step. I think some of my female cousins that would join the DAR are not able to because they're on my maternal line. And so that's why I'm working really hard to find that information on my mom's side. I'm actually probably even eligible to join the Daughters of the Confederacy under the same Riley line, but I'm missing again, some key documentation that I need for that application if I decide to go that route, which I'm not quite sure if I will or not. But again, it's part of my history. It's part of who I am. So if I can find that information, then I would consider that. I have found some gray ancestors that weren't on the Mayflower, but who were in Plymouth Rock. So I'm descended from some of those folks who came from Plymouth on that paternal line as well. And then on my maternal line, my mother's father's line, I found out that they are actually French Huguenots with the Flournoy family that fled France and came to Henrico and settled in Henrico, Virginia. So if I can, again, find just a couple more key documents, I can document the Flournoys as being part of that lineage as well.
Have any of your male relatives expressed any interest in joining a lineage society based on your research?
Yeah. So once I joined the DAR, I reached out to my dad and I said, hey, you're eligible to join the Sons of the American Revolution. And so was my brother James. And so they did. So they are both inducted into the Sons of the American Revolution. And then I also signed my 3 children up to be part of the Children of the American Revolution. And my eldest son, Paul, was just selected to be the South Carolina State Chair of the Veterans Committee for the Children of the American Revolution. And I was selected to be a senior mentor for the Conservation Committee on the state level and to vice chair the Charlestown Society of the Children of the American Revolution.
Why would your father and brother want to join the Sons of the American Revolution?
Well, for the same reason that I joined the DAR, to be able to honor Jacob Riley, to be able to honor the ancestor that fought in the Revolutionary War, and to do service activities and to contribute to the community in that way where they live.
Are you active in your chapter? Do you do service activities yourself?
So since I relocated to South Carolina, I was going to join one chapter and I was not able to get a hold of anyone. And actually, one of the ladies in the chapter where I ended up transferring to South Carolina found me on Facebook. And she befriended me and she made the ask. Sometimes it's just about making the ask of, hey, would you like to come and join our chapter? So I went and visited one of their meetings, and they were very friendly, very welcoming. And they invited me to their Christmas luncheon, which I attended, and I decided to, go ahead and transfer my membership. So with the transferring of my membership was right when COVID hit and right when the lockdown started. So we've been meeting virtually, and I have resumed my leadership course within the DAR. And so my capstone project will be working with the DAR chapter here in South Carolina on their website and helping the CAR get noticed online with various social media platforms.
What have you done with the information that you've collected?
I decided that I wanted to put all of my research efforts in writing. I wanted to document my journey. And so I decided to write a book, and I named it Navigating the Path to Discover My 6th Great-Grandfather, Jacob Riley, Riley Road. And it was more or less the methodology that I used to find Jacob Riley. I ended up self-publishing Riley Road on Amazon, and it's like 75 pages. Yeah, and so it became very popular because the Riley reunion was that summer. So really my deadline was to try to get it ready for this family reunion that was going to be held that summer. And so I published it and took a gazillion copies, or at least my dad did, went and took a gazillion copies to the family reunion, and they sold it. And people, actually, I got a call a couple weeks ago from a cousin who said, "Hey, is your book still for sale?" And I said, "Absolutely." So folks are still reading about it. And again, I wanted to document my journey and put it in writing. I think it's very important to document your journey, find these relatives, document. And if you're able to apply to one of these lineage organizations, do it. Put it in writing for someone else to find. Maybe a long lost cousin that you don't know about wants to join. And once you've documented it, it's there. It's done. It's a great way to reconnect with family members and to connect with new family members.
Is there anything from your book that you would like to share?
Actually, I ended up, one of my favorite songs is Country Roads by John Denver. And I really wanted to use that song in my book, but with copyright issues and getting permission, it was really difficult. So I would listen to John Denver's song constantly as a source of inspiration. And one night in the middle of the night, I said, you know what? I should write my own lyrics. I should write a poem. And so I ended up coming up with Riley Road, and I included the poem in the book. And as I wipe back the tears, I'll read Riley Road. Traveling down Riley Road, looking for my lost abode. Yes, I have no doubt that my ancestors are calling out, like genetic Morse code tapping on my heart. Even though we are miles apart, it is loud and clear. These voices that I hear, I cannot deny the tears in my eyes as I pine away, looking desperately every day to find them, to find me. For it is me that I seek, in the depths of the deep, walking, running, driving there. It is a heavy load that I bear on this lonely stretch of road that generations before me sowed. Now it is time to reap tears of joy in a timeless feast. The smiley Rileys are my kin. My face is radiant as I grin. Generations past foretold that I would come home on Riley Road.